Good morning, Randy.
Good morning.
How are you?
Doing okay? How you doing?
Doing well. And thanks for your time for this second episode of the EOR podcast. And today I'd like to have more kind of, an exchange, a discussion about a very hot topic, I would say, which is injectivity. And we can cover, of course, different field cases and different aspects of that. But maybe I'll start with personal observations. So I had the chance to participate in many projects and the design of some of them. And the first question was always, we are afraid of losing injectivity when we switch from water to polymer. And so what's your feeling and what has been your answer about this for the last years and since you've been basically working in this area?
Yeah, so let me first say, of course, it's very natural concern about injectivity because everybody knows polymer solutions are more viscous than water. So the natural physics says you would expect it to take, it would be more difficult to inject maybe a viscous polymer solution than water. And, as a general, everyone knows the faster you inject fluid into the ground, the faster you're going to recover your oil. So there's a natural concern if you are going to lose that ability to inject the fluid, that maybe that's going to slow down your oil rate. Our actual observations on this and the theory both depend a lot on whether you're dealing with a vertical wells or horizontal wells. And we've got field cases to support both issues that could make us feel better. But certainly in polymer flooding, we want to keep the injectivity at an acceptable level. Let me maybe start quickly with vertical wells, because vertical wells have been used for polymer injection for quite some time. Horizontal wells really didn't start till about 2003, 2004. But in vertical wells, an observation, as long as I've been in this business, is that people have noted that the actual polymer injectivity in most cases was not all that much lower than water injectivity. Like if you're injecting polymer that's 10 times more viscous than water, you might expect maybe 10 times lower injectivity. And that's rarely what happens. What you're like I say, maybe a little bit lower than water, but not a terrible amount. And we've wrestled with what could be the cause of that for a long time. A lot of speculation about rheology and some black magic type of things. But the ultimate answer, very, very clearly in my mind, has come out with vertical polymer injection wells. If you're putting in polymer in a practical polymer field setting, with vertical wells, you are necessarily have something that's either a fracture or something that looks like an open fracture in that well. And it's actually pretty easy to prove if the data is provided to you. And what happens is if you're injecting water, for example, maybe the fractures aren't open at all. But when you start injecting polymer, those fractures open and they simply extend to accommodate whatever it is you're injecting. So if you're injecting a certain polymer concentration, the fractures extend to a certain extent. And it looks like your actual polymer injectivity is not really all that much lower than the water injectivity. If you inject a higher concentration of polymer, a more viscous polymer, the fractures just extend a little farther. If you inject faster, the fractures extend a little farther. If you inject dirty water, the fractures just extend a little farther. So that's kind of the really only viable explanation for what people have seen in the field. You really can't rely on rheology to explain what we're seeing with. Now, that doesn't say it certainly do have to be concerned about where and how those fractures are extending. If the fractures go the wrong direction, you could get a very direct pathway to your production well and cause severe channeling. If those fractures extend upward too far, you could compromise your reservoir seal. So you certainly have to worry about that. But the reality is fractures are critical for polymer injection in injection wells, in vertical injection wells. And we have taken advantage of that, and we want to take advantage of that. A big point is that ignoring the presence of those fractures, you're just sticking your head in the sand, and you could potentially get yourself in trouble. So, my position, like I say again, is if you've got a vertical polymer injection well, you've got a fracture or a fracture-like feature, you might just as well face it and work with it as opposed to try to deny it. So
So,
start with that.
yeah, because my experience is it's always been scary for reservoir engineers and anyone who has to face regulation in whatever countries, could be Canada or Europe, because basically, if you tell people that you have fractures, then you can be in trouble. So that's the kind of thing which is very difficult to address. And so yes, fractures are here, they are necessary, but in the same time, if you mention the name and the word fractures, then people get scared. And so no one basically wants to hear the fact that if you want to get anything into a reservoir which is viscous or more viscous than water, even if sometimes water, I mean, you are under fracturing regime, you just look at the whole plots, the rate goes up and down and the pressure doesn't blink in even water floods. And so that's not surprising that when you will switch to polymer, then you won't see any pressure response. The injectivity might stay the same. And the question is, yeah, okay, so if that's not fractures, and I'm afraid to mention even the word, so how can I justify the project and even going forward for the full field or anything like this?
Yeah,
And
that's a good point. And I have to admit, I'm not a politician, and dealing with regulators is always a concern. I mean, if they give an edict, you have to follow it. That's the truth. Um, I guess maybe two bits of an encouragement. You got two types of regulators. Some of them, a lot of them, I mean, the reason that they set up like things like the Texas Railroad Commission and all these different commissions is to hear logic for exceptions to rules. And of course, it's always possible you get somebody rigid and say, this is the rule and we're not going to violate it no matter what, in which case you're pretty much stuck. Although I will come back with a potential positive answer to that. But a lot of times the regulators just want to hear logic. They rightly want to make sure that you aren't injecting out of zone, where you're not putting your fluids that you're injecting where they're not supposed to go. That's a very legitimate concern. And so, you need to be providing some evidence that you're not doing that. They would also be rightly concerned that these fractures or fracture-like features are going in the wrong direction and are going to cause severe channeling. And obviously, you should be concerned about that as well.
yeah.
Both of those you should be concerned about. So the point is, if you've got reasonable regulators and you've got data to support your position and why you're doing it, they will be a lot of times accommodating. Now, let me go to the non-accommodating regulators a little bit. One of the things that usually gets established is somebody will establish a fracture pressure or a formation parting pressure. And it'll be maybe basically one test that somebody goes out early on and they do maybe a step rate test or something to find out where that fracture breakdown first occurs. Okay, and then they say, and that becomes a figure etched in stone from that point on. A positive thing is that very often the first time that rock breaks down, that's going to be the highest pressure that you're going to be seeing. Now, something that not everybody realizes is that that fracture opening pressure is not a fixed number. I mean, it may be the first time you do the frac, but my experience is, if you've already done the fracture, the next time you come or open the fracture for the first time, the next time you come, maybe it's not so difficult to open that fracture. right? So the regulator says you will not exceed this pressure because, you know, God or somebody told them that that was the fracture pressure. And a lot of times you're not going to anyway, even if you wanted to, because the fractures are just going to be extended, and it's easier to do that. Also, an experience we had in Suriname and other places is, you know, the apparent fracture opening pressure and closing pressure varies every time you do it. You do it the first time, it's one number. You do it the next time, it's a little bit lower number. You do it the next time, it's a little bit lower number yet, right? So it's not really a fixed number. So, you know, okay, dealing with the regulators, like I say, I'm not a politician, but that's a suggestion that might help you. Um, if but the reality for you as an engineer and trying to design a polymer flood, again, is to be aware of the realities and not just stick your head in the sand, because this does have a very important practical consequence, which most people miss. Okay, and that is in vertical wells with water flood, you say, well, I'm going to establish some kind of water flooding pattern. Maybe I'm going to use a 5-spot pattern or some kind of trendy pattern that you think is nice based on some kind of concept that maybe the reservoir is relatively homogeneous. But the absolute reality in all these reservoirs is that there's a preferred stress direction. There's like 3 different stress directions, the one on the top from the overburden, and you got 2 others that are dependent on the tectonic stresses that you have around that area. And they're, you know, virtually always different in one direction than another, which means that fractures or fracture-like features want to grow in a particular direction as a general rule. And so what I'm saying is, in a polymer flood, it's a mistake just to say, well, I'm going to use a 5-spot pattern, whatever I was using with my water flood, because in a water flood, maybe you're not going to have this formation parting problem, but in a polymer flood, especially with vertical wells, you need to take advantage of those fractures or fracture-like features, and you want your established pattern so that the fractures are growing in the right direction and are not going to be going directly towards a production well. You need to be basically shooting for a line drive type of flow configuration. So that's a very important consideration in polymer flooding that most people miss.
But when I've been looking at the field cases, because the issues with injectivity and fractures, it took some time for the industry to write about that. And I remember the papers that first struck me was, I mean, there were others, but really was one from OMV, where they were really taking into account the fractures, and even saying that the first volumes of polymer was getting, you know, kind of sacrificed just to open the fractures and then get the flow back and the flow inside the reservoir. I want to come back to Suriname, because Suriname is more unconsolidated. And I had a case in Eastern Europe, and I'd like to pick your brain on this one. So the issue I had in this reservoir was people at the time set a maximum pressure of 50 bars. So 50 bars, again, you should not go above that. And the way it was determined was using step rate test. But when we started polymer injection into these unconsolidated reservoirs, horizontal wells, 100 centipoise, then we quite fast reached these 50 bars max pressure. And of course, the first reaction is we have to decrease the rate right away, because otherwise, you know, we will have problems. So 2 options: either you decrease the rate or you decrease the viscosity. But if you decrease viscosity, then you lose efficiency. So people say, okay, if you are really scared, you decrease the rate. Let's see what happens. And of course, what should have happened, which is they decrease the rate, but the pressure kind of slightly increased a little bit, and they had to decrease the rate again until a point where basically it would make no more sense to even consider injecting polymer. So what I said at the time was, look, guys, just try something, keep injecting very slow and see what happens, monitor everything you can, run the whole plots, have some well testing. And so step by step, we went from 50 bars up to 80 bars without any change in slope or any, any big breakthrough event or like nothing. And so my understanding at the time was the behavior in unconsolidated formations when you inject very slow seems to be very, very, and looks very, very different than from consolidated formations. And two things I like to discuss with you was step rate test basically seems to be, kind of strange tools in unconsolidated, because it's like, when you have a rock on the windshield, if you have a fast impact, you break everything. But with polymer, if you slowly inject and you have some decompaction and dilation, then it means that you can probably reach pressures that you can't reach when you do a step rate, just because, I mean, basically you don't allow the geomechanics to do their job, and to relax, or the reservoir to absorb the shocks. So that's the first one. And so the second about that is, people at the time were talking about fractures and unconsolidated, and I still can't picture what fractures would look like in unconsolidated. I picture leak off or very complex geometries, but nothing like what we would expect, I would say, in consolidated. So coming back to Suriname, so is also the reason why everything was changing, because you had polymer and you changed the pressure regime and you changed the permeability, porosity during the injection. So what are your takes on these thoughts and observations?
Well, certainly, first of all, you are right. In unconsolidated formations, we've seen some unusual things, and Pelican Lake has seen some unusual things associated with unconsolidated formations too. Let me maybe start conceptually and then work from there, because the realities in the field can be very dependent on a particular situation. But let me start with just something conceptually. A lot of times people say, how can you have a fracture in an unconsolidated reservoir? And a lot of times they'll push this concept of dilation. And the concept of dilation that's usually presented is, that the whole near wellbore region expands uniformly. And not to say that couldn't happen, but again, because of the stresses that you have, it's very likely that it doesn't happen, and that you get something that looks like a fracture-like feature. And the logic goes like this. Again, assuming you don't have exactly the same stresses in at least the two horizontal directions, one of those directions is going to be preferred. So if there's going to be a failure, the feature, whatever it is, the opening where the break occurs, is going to be basically kind of in a linear type of fashion. And so maybe you don't want to call that a fracture, but it still is a linear type of feature. A lot of people throw out the term wormhole, but again, wormhole is way going the wrong direction, because wormhole is going to be a circle. And you've already said that, one of your stresses, let's just say if you've got a significant overburden, the top stress is going to collapse that wormhole. So you're not going to get a wormhole. You're going to get something that's looking like a linear feature. So my point is, unless you've got everything perfectly balanced and all your stresses are just right, you're not going to get just general uniform dilation of things. You're going to get something that's directional. Now, at least a decade ago, Shell put out some very nice papers where they were looking at what do these failures look like in unconsolidated sand? And yeah, you're not going to get a nice, very small crack like you do in a hard rock, a consolidated rock, what you're going to get is like a disturbed loan. It's still linear, and maybe you'll get like slip zones with multiple fractures, and maybe the whole feature is maybe, I think in their case was about a foot wide type of thing, but it's still basically a linear feature, right? So that's something I think maybe to help people conceptualize what might be happening there.
Would we see still something like an abrupt change in the pressure, for instance, versus rate, or could it be more progressive or based on
the step rate test, you're saying, right?
well, no, globally speaking, because for instance, you have cases in vertical wells perforated where if you increase viscosity to a certain point, sometimes you clearly see a break in the whole plot going downwards, which means you really have opened maybe a fracture, another fracture, or a series of fractures. So that's the thing. But very often what I've observed in unconsolidated is, well, step by step, the pressure is building slowly if you allow it to do, and you can reach much higher pressure than anticipated. And at least macroscopically at the wellhead in the pressure gauges, you don't seem to have the kind of behavior that you might observe into vertical consolidated formations. I mean, vertical wells, consolidated formations. So, because there were papers from in Canada, I forgot the name of the person, I think it was Zhu or Zheng in 2015, where they were assessing in the lab this dilation and these geometries of things and fractures, because yeah, that we're saying it was a combination of matrix permeability enhancement transforming into a different feature, and everything was moving all the time, so it was really obviously not fixed. And so it seems that we don't observe the exact same pressure responses, I mean pressure trends, in when we monitor these changes in unconsolidated versus consolidated, which is not very surprising. But I would expect sometimes when you really have, something that starts, that opens, or that breaks through a more visible change.
Yeah, and I know in some of the discussions I've had, especially with some of the Canadian folks, is it appears, just like you said, to be almost a time-dependent phenomenon, that you get the presence of the polymer and the unusual pressure gradients that are happening when you put in the polymer are causing interesting and odd, unexpected things to happen. Maybe, we speculated maybe there was a compression and you got really compaction of the sand in different areas, one area versus another. So, I don't know that I have a definitive answer on all of this. I think you're right in some of the unconsolidated observations that, there's more understanding that we really need. Now, it is interesting, you said in your particular case that you went well above the the designated parting pressure or fracture pressure and had no problems with channeling. There's two concerns when people go high or above what they call the parting pressure. One of them is just excessive fracture extension or extension of something too far. And the second thing is, and maybe more important thing, is fracturing out of zone, cutting through your reservoir seals. And that one is probably the most important one. And the key thing from the regulator's viewpoint, from your viewpoint, is to be monitoring that and to making sure it's not going out of zone where you want to. I'll point out another interesting thing that we've known for high permeability formations, that the fracture people have known for a long time, is that the more, especially unconsolidated rock tends to be higher permeability. The more permeable the formation, the shorter the distance, those fractures or fracture-like features are going to extend.
Yeah.
So maybe in a hard rock, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of feet. Um, in unconsolidated rock, maybe it's 10 feet or 30 feet or something, much more limited, in which case, maybe even if it's going right towards a production well, it's just not going to get anywhere close to being a problem. I like to mention the fact that in the 1950s, people had done some really nice work that shows that even if a fracture is pointed directly at an injection well towards a production well, that's not going to significantly compromise your sweep efficiency so long as that fracture doesn't extend more than about 1/3 of the distance between the two wells. So that at least helps you. So, bottom line summary on all that from my viewpoint is, yeah, there's some mysteries there. We need to be figuring them out. Um, when we're going above the regulated parting pressure, we need to be monitoring things and being careful. But as you suggested, sometimes we can get it to work and there's no problem. And we just got to be monitoring things pretty closely.
There's been some, I mean, the analogy is stops very fast, but when you look at the fracturing industry, for instance, that's what you were mentioning. When you have high permeability formations, it's difficult to propagate fractures very far. You have leak off, and basically you can, it's difficult to fracture a large sponge, I would say, with big holes. And the fracturing formation, when they design the wells very well and low permeability and things, that's where you see that they still sometimes have a hard time to propagate fractures very, very far. So, of course, the thickness of the formations is different. Many things are different, and the wells are designed to really optimize the creation and propagation of fractures. But when you see the difficulty with which fractures propagate even in low perm formations and in this area, then when you look at the wells and what we have today in some of the formations, well, as you said, it's like you should not connect the injector and the producer, but very often these things you will see very fast because you will have like the water cut might go from, if it was 55, it might go to 100%. The moment basically you reach the point where you have, you have opened the fracture too much. So then you can go back. And some very interesting examples also I've seen is when people say, well, no, it's not fractured. And you look at the whole plot and they go from 20 centipoise to 50 centipoise. There is no change in the slope. Then they go from 50 centipoise to 100 centipoise, still no change in the slope. And then for whatever reason, they go down from 100 centipoise to 50 centipoise. And now you see a change in the slope and an upward trend of the whole plot, which is basically telling you that, yeah, so I had fractures, and now because my viscosity is less and my pressure and everything is less, no, I'm closing down my fractures. And it was the evidence that, well, it was fractured before, and you didn't want to acknowledge that it was there. But look, that's the best evidence you can think of with this change and lowering the viscosity in that case.
Excellent point. Excellent point. Right. Yeah.
And maybe if we come back to the beginning, so a question I'm trying also to ask around is, what is an injectivity issue? Because I think the problem sometimes, and the thing we forget is, if I take the cases in Canada with long horizontal wells, heavy oil, in some cases, you have 10% of the well taking 100% of the water. So you have a very good injectivity, but you have a very poor sweep. So my question is it a good injectivity to have this 10% of the well taking everything, and the fact that you might switch to polymer and improve the sweep and conformance and observe maybe a decrease in injectivity, is it that bad? Depending
Yeah,
on how much
I
you play on water and oil in the production wells.
Yeah, I agree with you on the profiling. If only 10% of your horizontal well is taking the fluid, that's of concern. So I mean, it raises a number of very important points. number one is just we need good profiling tools. Our horizontal wells are getting longer and longer, and we need profiling. It is critically important that we get profiling tools that we can actually go out there in a cost-effective way and use them. Because if we don't have that knowledge, then we're just guessing, and we could be not getting anywhere close to the full value of that horizontal well and of that polymer flood. So that's point number one. There is a substantial need for good profiling tools for horizontal wells. Second point, what your point is exactly right on the, if just a small fraction of your horizontal well is taking all the fluid, then you're wasting a lot of your horizontal well. Let me use an example from Milne Point. The first pattern that they used up there, this is the north slope of Alaska, that Hilcorp's operating this really excellent polymer flood. The first pattern that they used was called the JPAD pattern, and they had east-west directed horizontal wells. And they had injected about a 10% pore volume bank of polymer, and the designed polymer oil mobility ratio was about 1. So in a perfect world, you don't really expect to get polymer breakthrough till at least 50% pore volume type of injection. But what we saw was breakthrough in about a 10% pore volume bank. And the reason, I think pretty much everybody accepts it now, is that out near the toes of these horizontal wells, there is a north-south directed fracture or fracture-like feature, or what they call a matrix bypass event, that is allowing that polymer basically to be wasted, to go more directly than it should between the two wells. I mean, that pattern was still phenomenal in terms of giving you a great polymer flood response. But we could compare that, where in that JPAD pattern, where we had east-west directed horizontal wells, go to the LPAD pattern, where polymer injection was started at the same time. And there, the horizontal wells were oriented north-south. Okay. And there it took much, much longer to get polymer breakthrough, like 3 times longer to get polymer breakthrough. And the oil in that LPAD pattern was 3 times more viscous than in the LPAD pattern. So everything said that in that particular case, drilling the wells north-south was a lot better than drilling in east-west. And it gets to the point. I mean, I made a big deal about fractures, knowing the direction that fracture growth is critically important in vertical wells. Is critically important in horizontal wells too, because I mean, if you have something that wants to grow, again, always in a polymer flood, you're going to be pushing the limits of injectivity. You're going to try and get that polymer in as fast as you can, and that's necessarily going to risk propagation of fractures or fracture-like features. If the fractures are extending in a useful direction, so that it's just extending your line drive flow configuration, there's no harm. It's not really hurting you. But if it's the opposite way, you've got a big problem. So just to amplify on both my point and your point, yeah, the direction that fractures or fracture-like features want to grow is critically important in all polymer floods. It really does affect the patterns that you want to put in.
So that's the first point, which is, as you mentioned, so understanding the fracture direction, and also not to be too scared of losing some injectivity if you had a poor conformance to start with, I would say, because if you lose, for instance, 20% injectivity, but the water cut, you lose 50%. It's been the case in some of the patterns in Milne Point, where it went from 70% to 7%. It's like crazy results, and it's really, really amazing. So if you lose some injectivity, but at the same time you almost produce no water, then is losing some injectivity a problem? And or I mean, to which extent? To which extent, basically, you can still manage to make money and to have your business case, I would say, up and running. So that's probably an important point. And so to come back on the injectivity issue, so
let me elaborate on
yep.
that point just a little bit, that might help people. Because another thing observed at Milne Point, there was just a paper presented at Tulsa with Matt Dean and
And Almas,
Almas, yeah, and a lot of other
Reed,
Hillcorp
yeah.
folks. And basically, if you looked at all of that data in detail, you could basically divide the two kinds of patterns and two kinds of injectivity. So they have one set of patterns where um, polymer injection was right from the start. There was no water flood before those. And for those cases, both from a facility viewpoint and a reservoir viewpoint, there really wasn't an injectivity issue. Those were the cases where the injectivity was pretty much flat and constant the whole time. And I would argue that that's actually fairly easy way to think about that. In very much agreement with my thinking, they designed the polymer oil mobility ratio to be about 1, very roughly in that vicinity. And if I'm injecting polymer solution that has about the same mobility as the oil that I'm displacing, I don't really expect an injectivity loss, right? I mean, expect the injectivity to basically be constant, and because I've got unit mobility displacement throughout the thing. So that fits with kind of our reservoir engineering concept. Now, there's a lot of other cases where they had injected a substantial amount of water before polymer injection, and those are the cases where in polymer injection had a significant effect on injectivity. And I would argue that's not a terrible surprise, because you've got the water in there, the water is broken through, it's formed viscous fingers and all kinds of pathways, and the dominant pressure through the reservoir is established by basically water in these viscous fingers. So if you start putting polymer into those viscous fingers, of course you're going to start slowing things up. And that's, kind of as a general rough rule, if you look at that data, you see that the injectivity for the cases where they'd been water flooded previously, you'll typically see that that the polymer injectivity decline roughly, depend on a well basis, but roughly about 50%. And it's because the polymer is filling those viscous fingers, and what do you expect? That's what's going to happen. So.
And so, but because we touched base on during the first podcast about this observation, which kind of brings water, I would say, not even bring water, but proved in the fact that it might be better to start polymer as secondary versus tertiary in some heavy oil case. But we also discussed the lab evidence by other authors like Skogge and Sorby, for instance, who show that having previous water injection and creation of fingers could help in some cases basically recover oil at lower mobility ratios. So I would personally trust more the field evidence, because here, I mean, the point they went from pilots in 2017 to full field, and they gathered so much experience in all these cases. And what we see, what they see, is indeed that you don't have much injectivity losses in secondary, while in tertiary, with all the water fingers and previously water injected, you seem to have lower injectivities. So would there be a difference, I mean, in the mechanism and the concept between the lab, where basically we also discussed a little bit the fact that all the tests were run at fixed injection rates, while in the reservoir you might be more pressure controlled. So what could be the reason why, or is it working in some cases and some not? So what might be the some answers behind these observations, at least?
Yeah, no, you point out this is some good area that a lot of people are discussing and we're trying to figure out. I mean, just to summarize, as your observation is for a number of cases, Milne Point, Pelican Lake, some other folks, that they just observe well, observationally that the patterns with polymer injection right after primary have done better than those where you've got water flood injection in between the start of polymer flood. And I'm not sure I could say, I mean, we've got a couple of people out there that have a few good ideas on what might be contributing to that, but you can't ignore Scaugi's really good data on that there might be some benefit. And as we discussed in the previous one too, if you go directly from primary to polymer injection, there's a lot of reservoir description you might be missing. Maybe you don't have any clue what direction the fractures or fracture-like features want to grow, and maybe you establish that kind of thing during water injection. So, there's pluses and minuses on both sides, and I can't tell you that I have that it's figured out by any means, and we need to do
So if
on
you had
that.
to make a guess or to provide some I would say thoughts about how much water you have to inject before you start any EOR method, because in the end the goal is to minimize water fingering, to have a good displacement, and to maximize the recovery of oil at breakthrough. So what would be the minimum amount you would inject in these cases? If you had an oil field and say, okay, I need to characterize how much would you inject to be sure that you don't compromise too much also maybe the polymer injection, because one of the risks of injecting too much water is once we have water breakthrough, it's extremely difficult to fix. And the polymer will, of course, follow the path of least resistance, and you might have other issues. So the question is, how much water can you inject?
Yeah, and I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, if you just relied strictly, let's say, on fractional flow calculations, or maybe even a simulation largely based on that, you would say ultimately you're going to get the same amount of oil, and it really boils down to just the economics of when do you get that oil and what's the price of the oil at the time you get it, which is very unpredictable. So the bottom line is I don't have a good answer to that. I think all we can do is report the things that people have seen and try and figure it out. Maybe you have some thoughts on a preference on that, because I can't say I have a strong bias on that.
No, I mean that's a it's not an easy question, because what you want to understand, I think the most important is, can I inject the water first? Because I had a cases where basically people wanted to start a chemical EOR, but they they wanted to do a water pre-flush, and good for them because they could not inject the water because of compatibility issues. It was a softened water, and maybe they had underestimated clay or heterogeneity or both, and the pressure went to the sky, and they couldn't just inject the water. So to go back to to controlled fracturing, to bypass the cake, and start again the injection. So I think some water injection just to make sure that you can inject the water is a very good start. And maybe, of course, to understand some of the reservoir parameters, like maybe some boundaries, maybe the fracturing pressure if you do a step rate, for instance.
Right.
But the thing, I mean, if you look in a kind of absurd way back to what has happened, is even after 60 or 70 years of oil production with water flood, the oil recovery factor is still around 35%. So if we knew better our reservoir, how can we leave so much oil inside? Which is, a kind of strange, I would say, strange thing to look at, which is, well, if we really knew our reservoir, and because we know the mechanisms, we know some of the mechanisms, so if we could really well characterize everything, we should be able, with a certain amount of money, of course, to recover more oil than 35%. Because when, as an engineer, a 35% yield, for instance, it's not much. I mean, it's really not much. So my point is, water flood has been cheap and easy and efficient to maintain pressure and everything, but it leaves, let's say, not 65%, because there is some oil you can't recover, but it leaves the same amount, like 35% of oil inside reservoirs. And so, and despite 25, 30 years of injection sometimes. So
Yeah.
the reservoir, like I need water to characterize my reservoir, is like you might need some water to characterize a few things. But since anyways, with the wells you will be drilling, you will be sampling a very small portion of the reservoir, you will still be in the dark. But what I think we know as geoscientists and geologists is few exceptions, that all reservoirs are heterogeneous. They all are. So it means we will have a problem. The question is when. It's just the simple question is when will we have the problem? And so you have two kind of approaches. I would say the first one is I will fix the problem when it comes. The problem in that case, it's often very difficult and expensive because we will discuss later conformance water shutoff, but it's like placing anything to plug a matrix bypass event or, a reperm zone or anything like this is, if you have a fracture, as you always say, it's easier. But if you have just heterogeneity problems, the question is, okay, what can I do to kind of not fix my problem, but at least to manage the issues? And so on, all you have the other approach, which is, well, I know I have heterogeneities. I know they are here. I just don't know where they are. I can play on the geomechanics. This I can determine probably more easily than the rest. And then, okay, I say, since I know my water will cause me troubles in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, sometimes 7 hours, well, let's try something that is proven. And there are many things around there which I think are working well. So that's why the water injection is a complex problem, but the experience so far is like, well, it doesn't seem to be very, very, very efficient at what we want to achieve. So that's my take on this one.
Let me some excellent observations, but let me throw out something. I mean, on the issue of heterogeneity that might be of practical importance that I found to be useful. In my mind, it is critical to know if the heterogeneity that you have is just, layers of different permeability versus something that looks like a fracture or a fracture-like feature. I mean, that the treatment of those and the way you deal with those is radically different. And I think we do, at least in a lot of cases, have a very easy practical ability to make that assessment. Let's just say, for example, we're doing a polymer flood or a water flood, and we get breakthrough in a production well, and it's faster than we would have liked. So how do I decide if that feature is a fracture-like feature or a just layering that I have? And one of the things, just easy calculation, is propagation or transit through fractures or fracture-like features is necessarily really fast. Let's just say I had a slit, a fracture that's going between the two wells, and you look at just using Darcy's law. You say maybe I have 1,000 or 2,000 psi in my injection well and 1,000 psi or something less than that in my production well. So I have a defined pressure difference that I know. I know that the breakthrough is water, so it's viscosity of water, basically. I know the distance between the two wells. I can just apply a very simple form of Darcy's law and say, what's the rough permeability of that feature? Well, if it's a porous rock, then the simple calculations say, let's say a 1 Darcy type of permeability, it's going to take months and months to go from maybe 1,000 feet or a couple thousand feet through that porous rock. It has to be. So if your breakthrough is in that time frame, then you've got a good argument for saying, well, maybe that's a viscous finger, and we know that polymer is excellent for suppressing viscous fingers, so let's inject a higher polymer concentration. That's a solution. On the other hand, if your breakthrough is in 1 day, for example, the Darcy's law things tell us very quickly, there's absolutely no way that is a flow through porous rock. That's got to be flow through some super permeability feature like a fracture-like feature. And your treatment of that is totally different. It doesn't say inject higher polymer concentration because maybe you opened that fracture farther. It says, either realign the pattern or decrease the rate or put in some kind of gel treatment or performance control treatment. It says your approach is different. So anyway, that's something that practically might be of value to some people. So.
You just mentioned the very use of basic tools like the comparison of Darcy's law, so the expectation versus measurement. And I think indeed this is very simple. So what would be the most important parameter in this? So the thing you should not, I would say that the value you should not have wrong.
Well, the
Would be
breakthrough time, obviously, that's the first thing. I mean, you know what your injection pressures or maybe your downhole injection pressure is. You've got an idea what your downhole production pressure is. You know what the breakthrough fluid is, let's say water, the viscosity of that, the distance between the wells,
so the
maybe,
drawdown would be the
well, I mean, the drawdown you've got a rough idea on. The most important parameter is that breakthrough. And a lot of times on the breakthrough, people are using tracer tests, interwell tracer tests, which I'm very supportive of. I think it's one of the best things you can use. But sometimes people use it as a pulse. Sometimes people use it as just like if it's low salinity water displacing high salinity water, you can use that as a tracer, a cheap tracer. But if you use the pulse, you got to be really design the test well and keep really close track of when it breaks through. I mean, collect samples. You don't have to analyze every sample, but you got to be collecting a lot of samples so you make sure you get the tracer at the right time. If you miss it, then you make a bad judgment about the time. So
something also something very cheap, of course. So when you can have different salinities, injection water versus produced water, if you have something different in both, it might be helpful. But also something that I realize people don't use much, which is free, I would say, kind of free, is from time to time they have to do workovers into injection wells, for instance, to change a pumps or something. And something very simple to do is the day injection stops is to look at all the surrounding wells and see if some of these are collapsing. Like, the pressure is just the day you stop the injection, the pressure goes down like crazy, like in an hour. And so that would be the best diagnostic to say, here I
really
have,
cheap.
yeah,
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
have a very, very big problem I need to fix before I start anything.
Right. Good point.
To the injectivity issues. So normally people have got this covered, but so what can we expect when we start injection polymer? So it's like, well, there is what I think I call it the simulation scenario, where the moment you switch from water to polymer, the pressure goes to the roof. And here, indeed, you have a problem. The question is, what is the problem? Is it, my viscosity? Did I plug my well? I have now bad water quality. So it might not be the answer we think it is, and we need to figure out what has happened, I would say, first. Then there is the answer where basically the injectivity remains stable and where the injectivity is increasing. So I would say these two are more are easier to understand, fractures or fracture life type features. But when I come back to the question, what is a good injectivity? Also, the only time where we have to really, really worry, so there might be two times, because for people who don't believe in fractures, the fact there is no pressure increase for them means the polymer has been degraded. You see, that's very often the answer I get, which is I should see a pressure response when I start polymer injection. But then it depends on many things like the voidage replacement ratio, the fill up, if you had a good baseline, if you understood the reservoir well, and if you have characterized all the heterogeneities, maybe you have created fractures. So now the question comes like, if I have no pressure increase, how do I make sure that I have not degraded my polymer? Because people also are afraid of shear-thickening that will degrade the polymer when it gets into the matrix and these kind of things. So what would be your your suggestions or answer for the people who are worried about this part?
So there's been two excellent papers relatively recently. One associated with Mangala, which is my understanding, the second largest polymer flood in the world, and the other is with the Kalamkaz field in Kazakhstan. And these are both peer-approved SPE papers. And what they did was going through procedures where they're actually backflowing polymer solution from the reservoir back into the injection well and analyzing that to determine whether that polymer has been degraded or not. And along with that, a lot of work on establishing whether fractures or fracture-like features are there. And in both cases, number one, fractures or fracture-like features are there. And those fractures, even a small fracture, even a 10-foot long type of fracture, radically reduces the velocity at which the polymer enters the porous media. And that has two really major positive effects. One is it can completely eliminate mechanical degradation, and these two outfits prove that. And two, it puts you back into the low flow regime where you don't have to worry about viscoelasticity or dilatant behavior or shear-thickening behavior.
Yeah.
Completely killing your injectivity. So, I mean, there's two actual field data-based cases that demonstrate, if you're not seeing an injectivity decline, my argument, our argument is, you've got that's because you've got a fracture-like feature there. And number two, it's a positive thing, and people have shown that. If you're really worried about it, I really encourage people, even in any polymer flood, if they can, when that polymer gets to the production well, do some kind of test to try to collect that and see if it has degraded or not. And, a lot of people made an attempt at that in a bunch of different fields, 10 years ago and before that. And their conclusion was, yeah, we lost 90% of our molecular weight, which is ridiculous. I mean, if that were true, why would you do a polymer flood? Because you don't know where it was degraded. And what happened, which we showed at Suriname, is with a nice series of tests, was the sampling method is really critical, because once you put these polymer into the formation, it's probably going to pick up some iron too in solution. And then when you start producing it and you expose that to air, of course, just the redox reaction is going to kick in, and it's going to degrade your polymer pretty quickly. So by the time you get your lab and measure your viscosity, you're going to say, well, it's been degraded. And when in reality, it hasn't been. And the trick, like I say, in some of our Suriname papers, we show you how to do this to collect the sample and demonstrate that the polymer has not been degraded. Yeah, another thing you need to know is if your production pump is an ESP or a jet pump, that's going to degrade the heck out of the polymer. There's no way around it. So you can't be collecting the polymer after a jet pump or a ESP and expect it not to be degraded. It's going to be degraded. You got to use some other mechanism for collecting that sample.
Well,
Go
my
ahead.
view is to bounce back on this is, well, for me, unfortunately, I mean, it's good because you can, if you see polymer breakthrough, it means you can sample the polymer and analyze it. And that's good because if you have early breakthrough, at least it means that residence time and everything will be low, so there will be very little hydrolysis, and you can really almost sample the polymer you have injected. But my point here is, I mean, I would prefer never to see the polymer in the producers. Because if you see polymer in the producers, depending on the amount, of course, and so the concentration, but it means that you might have highly underestimated heterogeneity or created or open features that you don't want to have, because if you keep expanding them, then you might just compromise the full things. So I mean, it's good and bad, because if you as long as you fix, I mean, if you see polymer breakthrough, you sample, you check degradation, everything is fine. Next step for me would be to fix the problem, not to see it ever again, if I can, because the idea is, well, the day you have massive polymer breakthrough, or if you have underestimated heterogeneity, then at some point you might have issues. You might have, I don't say you will have, but you might have issues in the producers
Yeah.
and during the separation part. So
Yep. Good point. Good point.
so we discussed, so and so also to come back on this. So if I don't see, so the way, for instance, I would personally avoid asking myself the question, if I had or no degradation, the result being I don't see any pressure increase, would be basically to reperforate or clean the perforations, or to do, as you were saying, controlled fracturing. Because we also touched based on that, and many people, and I watched recently Richard Baker were saying that even during water flood, you propagate fractures, and after some years, sometimes you reach the producers. And I think, so depending on the stress directions, of course, sometimes the perforation can be the initiation of small features that will expand, just because during water flood, the water quality can be extremely poor. I saw people re-injecting water containing 1% oil, then some solids. So, I mean, if you keep the rate and you don't see the pressure blinking, it means you are creating fractures, or and enhancing your perforation size and dimensions, basically. So it's going deeper in the formation. And so the point to be sure that you want to minimize mechanical degradation is, well, just, yeah, controlled fracturing, more perforations, more area for the polymer to enter the reservoir, and you will be fine. And of course, the idea is not to push these too far to connect the producer, but that would be probably something to avoid looking at fake problems, I would say, because I consider these as, for instance, for me, shear-thickening, as I see it in the lab, which is well studied. If you have perforations and small fractures and some fractures, it basically disappears. And so why would you even consider investigating this in the lab if you can avoid that in the field right away by reperforating in the vertical wells, or cleaning the perforations, or changing the orientation to play on the geomechanics, as you were mentioning? So that's something, for instance, I would try to not even consider. I mean, it's fun probably for research purposes, but in the field, anyway, you don't want that. So the question is, how can I avoid that? And maybe one of the answers is, well, yeah, controlled fracturing and more space for the polymer to enter. That would be at least my idea behind that.
I would agree with you, and just to kind of summarize or express it a little bit of a different way. Mechanical degradation, shear degradation of polymer in the formation is far less of a problem than we had thought in the past. That's just the reality. Now, we don't want to deny that shear degradation in surface facilities is really important, and you can't use traditional chokes, and you can't use centrifugal pumps and things like that, because you'll degrade it on the surface. So you know, I don't want to discount the importance of shear degradation in surface facilities, but in the formation, I agree with your implication that that shear degradation and viscoelastic behavior are far less important than we maybe thought they might be in the past. I do want to make one other point, though, on another side, that has to do with where laboratory evaluations are underdone and of high value, is with respect to assuming what you have for a relative permeability curve during the polymer injection. And especially up in Canada, where we have very viscous oils, a lot of times I see people making assumptions that their relative permeability endpoints to water are pretty darn high, and maybe it's based on some kind of history match or simulation, or just history in general, but not based on any true measurement of what's in your formation. And when you think about that, that is critically important, maybe more important than we want. There is a natural tendency when operators go into the polymer flood, is I don't want to be just getting a lot of laboratory data for the sake of getting laboratory data. It needs to be useful. And my point is that relative permeability data is critical for polymer flooding because it determines what's the right polymer concentration and viscosity to be using, right? I mean, if your endpoint is really 0.3, that says one thing for your ideal polymer concentration. If it's 10 times less than that, that says another thing. And we very much proved that at Cactus Lake that we could use a 25 centipoise polymer and basically get a unit mobility displacement of 1600 centipoise oil, and you would never have guessed that in advance, right? I mean, you have to do the experiment. And so what we did was we injected water in one core flood and 5 centipoise polymer in others, and 15 centipoise, 25 centipoise, 50 centipoise, 200 centipoise. And what we found was that the 25 centipoise polymer certainly recovered more oil than the 15 centipoise and the 5 centipoise, but it didn't recover any more oil than the 50 centipoise and the 200 centipoise. So, it was a definitive and not terribly difficult set of experiments to show us that really 25 centipoise was the right way. And it said to us, well, our real endpoint for water is more like 0.03. It's not 0.3. And we had a good justification for using that. Now, I know in a lot of the Canadians, they just say, well, field experience, 25 centipoise is the right thing to use, or 30 centipoise or whatever. But, that's just based on a guess, and it might be the right answer. But if you haven't done some kind of laboratory experiment to confirm it, you don't know exactly where it is. And that's a pretty big deal because polymer cost is certainly, if not, well, the major chemical cost, the major cost in a lot of cases in a polymer flood. And you want to get it kind of right. This business of saying, well, mobility ratio of 28 even with my polymer flood is acceptable is a bad argument. I mean, you really shouldn't be using that kind of argument. You should go out, get the data, and then have a good reason for saying, all right, I'm close to a unit mobility displacement with my polymer, and I've got a good design here. Now, the other side of that was our problem at Suriname. We made assumptions about what the relative permeability ought to be without doing any type of experiment. And we grossly overestimated what the ideal polymer concentration ought to be. We played with talking about injecting 200 centipoise, and then we really did get into significant injectivity problems when we went that high. And it was because, I think, ultimately, because we didn't have any kind of relative permeability information. It told us the right spot where we ought to be.
And so, but in these cases, and if you go back to Cactus Lake, for instance, how would you take into account the heterogeneity? Because I suppose the mobility was based for one permeability or one set of relative permeabilities. So imagine that you have, I don't know, 7-meter thickness layers, and you have one which is more permeable somewhere at the top or at the bottom. So would you change the viscosity injected in that case, knowing that it might be optimum in a set of relative permeabilities taken from one sample representative of a portion of the reservoir, or would you keep it the same?
So ultimately, that comes down to the question, do the relative permeability curves change with the layer or the permeability that you have? And, that's something that I guess the simulators have wrestled with for 70 years or whatever. And you could make an argument, well, if you had an infinite lab budget, you would determine what the relative permeability curve was for all of those different possible layers. And I actually saw a guy claim that was true. I assume he was with a major, but I was with a major too, and they didn't like doing a lot of extra lab work either. So I think more often than not, people are going to try to make assumptions and shortcuts where they can. I don't know that the relative permeability is different as a function of permeability. I guess if it is, that affects what you should be measuring, but I think that's just kind of unknown territory, I suppose. But I think doing some experiments, at least with one set of permeabilities, is a lot better start than doing none, which is more often the reality of what we see. So,
And so coming back to the lab experiments, so I think it's been quite interesting the workflow, because many people I've worked with start with the lab, selecting a polymer, running the core floods, then put this into a simulation, and then decide if it's worth going to do a test or a pilot. The problem I have with the lab, I mean, it's very important to determine resistance factor and choose the right resistance factor, and determine retention, for instance. But since we're in injectivity, something the lab will never tell is how much can I inject in the field. Just basically because I don't have fractures, I don't have the near wellbore effects, and I don't have things. So if you had to put on the table a minimum number of tests in the lab before going to the field, what would these tests be?
well, so I don't know that I have a one size fits all area, but my first approach would be, say, what's your oil viscosity at reservoir temperature? What's the salinity of your water? Composition of your water? Basically, starting with the simple test that everybody does is getting viscosity versus concentration and shear rate um, for the water that you expect to be in place. Ideally, both for what you're injecting, if that and the formation water, if there happen to be different. So you can see what you're going to be losing if you get substantial mixing in the reservoir. That's the simple stuff everybody does to begin with.
And what about
I
the representativity? So because
of what?
so what you say, I know that you always consider the low shear viscosity in the core floods and relmeter, but what about the representativity of viscosity curves
Yeah,
versus
that's an
the
excellent
resistance
point.
factor?
Because our tradition is to use maybe 7.3 reciprocal seconds as the basis for the design. And that might be right for reasonable spacing and with vertical wells. But if you're talking about horizontal wells, the effective velocity and effective shear rate deep in the formation is far lower. So, you should try to make some kind of estimate, but more likely it's going to be on the order of 1 reciprocal second or significantly lower than that. So you're basically in the first Newtonian region, and that should be your choice of representative viscosity on that. So you have to look at the particular situation for it. But
Well, we'll discuss. We'll come back probably into more details in the lab, because I think there are a lot of interesting things, and I know you also have a strong opinion about residual resistance factor, which I do too, and also how to determine retention with oil, without oil, core conditioning, these kind of things. But we'll probably discuss this the next time. So if we come back to maybe the injectivity part, the issue I have, and with simulation, for instance, is we tend to use it as, unfortunately, I mean, the people who use it as a god, for me, especially for polymer flooding design, are very, very, of course, strong opinions about what should be done and what should not be done. But the problem is, if you just take the existence of fractures, then a lot of keywords that people are using basically lose their meaning. And one of them is shear-thickening, for instance. Shear thinning will be very limited into the near wellbore area. Then you use viscosity curves into a pristine environment, while in the field, some slight degradation might really improve your injectivity, because you will be removing the highest molecular weights first. So what's your opinion about simulation? So what do you like, or which people do you think are doing some good things, and the one are doing, I would say, more bad things with that?
Yeah, so I guess first maybe we should talk about why are, or at least briefly, why are people so interested in simulation? And it's because, of course, our managers or the people who fund our project, whether it be a hedge fund manager or doctors, lawyers, whoever, people with extra money to invest in something, they want a quantitative answer that I'm going to get, 23.785% rate of return on my investment. And simulators will give you that kind of a number. It might be a total nonsense number, but they will give a number, and people who maybe aren't familiar with the limitations of the oil field and of simulators might not know that the reality is they might just well be getting a negative 23.785% return on their investment, but at least what they're seeing is a concrete number that that they use for projection on the thing. I mean, the universal thing in simulation that every simulator has heard is garbage in, garbage out. And the unfortunate thing is not very many simulators believe that's true about their work, and they need to be more realistic about the assumptions that go into it.
I
As
like
you
also
said,
the I like the all the models are wrong, but some are useful, which is probably the right balance, I would say,
yeah,
for that matter.
yeah. Most simulators can't and don't predict injectivity, especially in vertical wells. Maybe they could in horizontal wells, but in vertical
So
wells,
how can we keep using or not questioning something that can't help us predict what we need?
I suppose you could just say, unless you're doing something exceptional or special, you just say, I don't trust the injectivity prediction from a simulator, and accept that, because they don't ever simulate fractures. They maybe try to expand the well bore, but that's an uh not physical way of doing it, because just expanding the wellbore radius doesn't say anything about the directionality that really is there with those fractures trying to grow somewhere. So, one of the things I think a lot of people have done is just say, well, I'm going to ignore the injectivity predictions of my simulator because I know they're not true. Start from there. Yeah.
No, no. And something I'm recommending to people also is, so there are limitations, but again, it's a tool, and as long as it is used as a tool, I think it's really important, because we need to get some feelings about what's going to happen. But you have the problem of the geology, which, as we say, we don't really know. Otherwise, we would probably recover much more oil if we really knew the geology and didn't have some upscaling problems between the very small lithological variations and the big cells. So something that we'll probably never get really right, because computing time and data. So that's something for sure. But about the mathematics, what I'm more surprised is, something I recommend to benchmark at least the simulation and understand what's happening is, can I reasonably predict with my lab input the pressure drop in my core flood? Because normally the core flood is the simplest geological model you can think of, and it's more or less homogeneous if you choose one which is. And so if using the basic inputs from the lab, like viscosity curves, for instance, which I think are kind of not the best, but you have to start somewhere, and the retention value that maybe you have determined in the core before. And if you want to put whatever, I would say, a keyword suits you, but can I predict reasonably well the pressure drop in my core flood, instead of trying to history match the results of my core flood, which is of course, you can. I think it's much more relevant to try to tweak few parameters which you control to try to see if you can match the prediction, instead of just, I have no control over. I mean, I can't understand precisely what's happening, and so instead of using my pressure curve, I will try to history match it with what I think is right. And so that would be at least one of my recommendation before running, the full field model and these kind of things, is can I decently run a simulation that tells me how much pressure drop I will have in the core, and does it match the reality? So that would be
I
something I
think I
think.
would agree with that very much. You made the point that these simulators have a massive number of what basically are adjustable parameters. And as you said, that isn't helpful to us. We need to know which ones really are important. And as you say, focusing on the pressure from a core flood actually tells us something physically, especially if there's internal taps on the core flood and we don't have any face plugging effects and things like that. I mean, it's helpful both from an experimental viewpoint and for extrapolating that to what's going to happen, what we should expect in the field too. Are there maybe some kind of compatibility problems, or maybe we're just really grossly off with the relative permeability curve? So I would agree with what you said. It's better to use that pressure data from the core data to make some pretty important judgments and really diminish the number of these massive numbers of knobs we can twist in these simulators just randomly to get the answer that we want. So
And it's, I mean, you've participated in some of the recent papers, but the trend that is revealing is people are coming back to analytical equations, analytical models. So
yeah.
the one from Milne Point, Eric Delamade, and people from UT, and also you as a co-author, are very interesting. It started, I think, I mean, in the 80s already, the equations were there, but the most recent time where I saw that coming back was the Captain field with a paper where they were using the analytical equations to better match the pressure and the injectivity. And it's been used more in the last years for the heavy oil fields, which I think is, yeah, really revealing about the weakness of current simulators, which is, well, if you can't predict one of the most important parameter to build your business case, which is what you said, is how much oil will I recover and what will my NPV look like? So what use do you have of something that basically can't tell you the most important things, which is still a puzzle for me. So again, if you do the test, the injectivity test or the pilot, and you use this data as an input for the simulation or to try to understand what was wrong in the first attempt, that's fine. But I've seen so many companies just not going to the field because they stopped at the simulation and the simulation said, the moment you start, the pressure will go to the roof. And it's always been against all the field evidence. And they start, I mean, it starts to pile up, I mean, the field evidence. So yeah, it's been quite interesting, but it's changing, I think, slowly, but changing.
Yeah, I agree with you from another viewpoint. And maybe another way of saying what you're saying is if you're going to be a simulator, you need to benchmark your simulations and start maybe on a simple level and make sure that you get a known physically reasonable answer before you just dump all of the random parameters in there and come up with something that's clearly absolute nonsense. So that, I think that fits with what you're saying. Is I mean, the simulators are basically using fractional flow type of stuff in them. That's basically what they're doing. So but it's just that they have a million other knobs and things to twist in there. And so you need to come back to a simple case and say, yeah, I know that answer is right. It makes sense before you start getting too crazy with the additional assumptions you put in. I agree with that very much.
I still have the polymer flood predictive model that was built by the Department of Energy in 1986, which is a streamlined simulator, 8-layer stream tubes. And I think it's been the most efficient and simple tool I've been using. The most difficult is it's not user friendly for the input, but the rest has more or less always matched the expectation, which is it has disappeared from the internet. I still have it, runs on MS-DOS, but it's been
Should put it on your website, maybe.
yeah, it's there. So I mean not there because difficult to put some exacts, but no, it's been there. Did you ever see a real injectivity issue? That's something that really required intervention, like something that was not supposed to happen.
Yeah, like I say, they say cases at Suriname, we made assumptions about what the relative permeability curves ought to look like without ever measuring them. And what they said is, we should be injecting a lot more viscous polymer solution. And when we did that, we got serious injectivity issues. And what, the real message was, there could have been a real super high value in actually measuring early the relative permeability curve so we could have avoided that mistake. You could argue that with Pelican Lake. They were super concerned about injectivity when they started that. They were really worried they wouldn't be able to get anything into the ground, and that would be the rate limiting step. And they just started with a low viscosity and started working their way up and found they didn't have any injectivity issues at all. Now, the big question is, what they're injecting, the optimum, or is there, and again, if you don't measure what those relative permeability curves, if you don't do something to measure those relative permeability curves, you don't know if you're close to the optimum or not. Cactus Lake is optimum at 25 centipoise. By analogy, you might hope that that's true for Pelican Lake too, but if you don't measure it, you don't know for sure, right? So, yeah.
What else did I have in mind? So,
Well, we
anything
had a nice
else?
long discussion here. I'm
Yeah.
sure there's a million more things we can go over, but
But
this is good for this
maybe a
session.
conclusion. So, what would you like people to remember about injectivity? So, what would be your conclusions or final bullet points on this talk?
Number one, if you're dealing with a vertical well, fractures or fracture-like features are there. You might just as well admit it and take advantage of them so before you get optimum injectivity and sweep improvement. Even with horizontal wells, knowing the direction of fracture growth is critically important. So your optimum well pattern is going to be, and the way you point your horizontal wells or your wells is going to be different than what you might expect in a water flood. And that's a lot of people miss that point. Second thing I would say is on a laboratory scale, you ought to be doing some kind of, maybe not necessarily relative permeability measurement, but at least doing core floods with different polymer concentrations to demonstrate, convince yourself that your chosen viscosity of polymer is the right one to give you an efficient displacement. A third thing, as you said, I think we've probably overemphasized shear degradation, mechanical degradation, and effects of viscoelasticity in the field, not in the surface facilities. They are important in the surface facilities, but in the field, the evidence that we have is just not there. It's not caused by the formation, and that's because fractures or fracture-like features are open, or if you're dealing with horizontal wells, your velocities are just so low in the first place, it's never going to happen. So, that's a summary, I think.
Well, thank you very much for your time. And in the next one, we'll probably come back to the laboratories. So resistance factor, residual resistance factor, what it means, if it has any meaning in the field, also in the injection strategies, and retention with oil, without oil, oil recovery tests. So that's going to be for the next time. And well, once again, thank you very much. And
Well, thank you.
have a very nice day.
You too.
Bye-bye, Randy.
Bye-bye.
Take care.